Okay guys, this is macroeconomics, lecture 18. The topic for today is theory of production, interest rates, and capital. This is the founding block for the theory of economic growth and the theory of business cycles. Growth we'll cover next week and business cycles in the coming 3 or 4 weeks. So let's begin. First of all is human action. So what I'll go through very quickly at the very beginning is a number of terms and concepts which should be quite familiar, at least intuitive to all of you. I'll just sail through them as there is little to discuss those. So we begin with human action, and this is people's deliberate or purposeful behavior so that they accomplish certain goals they're trying to accomplish. Then the next concept is ends, and ends is simply a good that directly or indirectly satisfies a person. These ends may be buying a house, a car, water, electricity, etc. So this is the specific commodity or good that provides a utility to a person. The next concept is that of means, and it simply represents the resources that people have available to them in order to attain their ends and goals. The next concept is that of utility, and this is the subjective appraisal that people get from their ends in attainment of their goals. The next concept is one that we have already covered, and that is scarcity. And scarcity relates directly to the concept of means. It simply says that the resources that are available to us are scarce in the sense that they're limited. Moreover, as we started the course at our very first lecture, scarcity is one way to look at the subject of economics and is the defining characteristic of economics. In other words, if something is scarce and brings utility to people, then it is the subject of economics. If something is not scarce, then it is not a subject of economics, maybe some other subject. Number 7 is entrepreneurship. And this is simply the human activity of creating, discovering, or realizing which goals can be attained through the limited or through the scarce means that people have. This is essentially figuring out how I can best accomplish what I want to accomplish. Entrepreneurship may be thought in consumer terms, where people would want to have their house, so how they search themselves for a house or for the right, let's say, car. It may be thought in terms of firms and businesses as to how can we produce a desired commodity that will be sold on the market, and how can we produce it best, meaning the way that it will give us the highest possible profit. The next concept is related to entrepreneurship, and that is plan of action. And these are simply the steps that we go through, or the steps that we plan or intend to go through in our entrepreneurial activity, in order to utilize scarce means and resources to obtain our ends and to achieve our goals. Then the next concept is stages of production. And we can effectively draw a somewhat logical line over here. Stages of production, essentially we begin to touch upon the production part of the economy. And these are simply the steps that are necessary to convert means into ends. We already discussed an example of stages of production which I elaborated many lectures ago. For example, getting gasoline into our car. It's certainly not just going to the pump and fill in the gas tank. You first got to get the rig, you got to drill, you got to find the oil. Once you find the oil, you got to establish the size and capacity of the oil well. Then the next step will be putting in a pump to pump it out from the earth out onto the ground. Then you got to establish in the next step a pipeline that will shift it over somewhere else, let's say to the port from where you're going to take it with a tanker. Then the next stage will be you need a loading dock where you can actually load the tanker. Then you need a tanker and so forth and so on. Then we have a concept which I've also touched upon in earlier lectures. These are first order goods. And first order, in general, the order refers to the closeness to the consumer. First order refers to the closest possible to the consumer. So, goods that are closest to the consumer, we can essentially say that these are equivalent to consumer goods. But it's a concept of production theory. Then you have second and respectively higher order goods. And second order goods are goods that are removed one step from the consumer. In higher order goods, maybe third, fourth, fifth, or 10th order good are goods that are removed many steps away from the consumer. First, second, and higher order goods are concepts related to stages of production. If it is in the very last stage of production, then it's a second order good. If it's already out of production, it's a first order good. If it has 3 stages before the end of production, in that particular case, we say that it's a third or fourth order good. Second higher. Then we move on to the concept of uncertainty. And the concept of uncertainty, I already explained last time, is omnipresent at any point in time and everywhere in the economy. This is our inability to forecast and foresee the future. And also, uncertainty relates to, in general, to nature. Sometimes we don't know when we're going to get a rain, or a hurricane, or an earthquake, and so forth. In general, uncertainty is related to the concept that the future is not predetermined. It is not predetermined, and it is not fixed. Then the next concept is of paramount importance in economics, and this is the concept of time. time is always present in economics. I'm not going to get into the philosophy of what time is, a completely different subject altogether. But number one, we can say that time is necessary, and it is a necessary component of production. Number two, it is inseparable in human behavior and in human nature. In other words, no matter what we do, no matter how we do it, it always takes time. And finally, time is the period or span that separates us from our goals. It may take a day to achieve our goal. It may take a year to achieve our goal. In your case, it may take you 3 or 4 years to achieve the goal of attaining a degree, bachelor's degree from the American University in Bulgaria. So we can say in short that time is of the essence. Then we move on to the next concept. I'll probably continue over here. Is that of time preference. And this is a fundamental concept in economics, and it is natural to humans that people prefer things sooner rather than later. In other words, you prefer to get your degree, if you could, tonight, but it just can't. It's going to take some time. Or if not, you prefer to get it next year, if you could, or 2 years down the road. So it's a simple concept that indicates that people have preferences for getting things sooner. And time preference also means, has a number of dimensions that I can clarify. Number one, they prefer to satisfy their needs sooner than later. That's the one I clarified. The next concept is that present goods are always preferred to future goods. In other words, having a bird today in your hands is worth more than maybe 2 birds 2 years down the road. You prefer to have that VCR today. You prefer to have that TV today. You prefer to have whatever, your car today. So that's the second way to clarify time preference. The third way to clarify time preference is that producers always want to produce in the shortest possible way. In other words, in the shortest period of time. So time preference in this case relates to time that the sooner they can produce it, the sooner they can possibly sell it, the sooner they can get their money back. In other words, they can take a profit and benefit from it. And the sooner they can get the profit, they can reinvest part or all of it back into the business of making even more profits. So time preference relates equally well to both consumers and to producers at the same time. And the last characteristic of time preference is that it is omnipresent. It is present at any point in time in the economy. If it were not present at any point in time, or was not present for a particular thing, then we wouldn't want to do that thing sooner. We wouldn't want to achieve our goal sooner, or producers wouldn't want to produce sooner, and then it will be, or we'll all be better off to delay on and on and on forever. Well, we don't usually see in nature things getting delayed eternally and forever, and thereby this is the argument that time preference is always present. Then we move on to capital goods. In capital goods, now we relate a little bit to the production of capital. Again, production, capital, these are intimately related concepts. So capital goods are the intermediate goods which have been produced so far but are not end goods. They cannot satisfy our needs directly, but will be used in production in order to move them from one stage to the next stage and ultimately get them to become consumer goods. Now, capital goods within their nature incorporate a combination of various resources, and we're talking about the standard resources that exist in the economy. And these standard resources are, first and foremost, time, then there is land, then there is labor. And there may be some other natural resource. Could be land, could be oil, could be rocks, could be earth, etc. Now, another remarkably important characteristic for capital goods is that an essential requirement to achieve or to obtain a capital good is that of saving. So, you cannot possibly get or obtain a capital good unless you save. And here I can make a little side note. If you would remember early on at the very beginning of the course, we said that in an economy, investments by definition are equal to saving. So at any point in time, in order to get a capital good, you must invest in it, and investing must come necessarily out of saving and nowhere else. So, capital good requires savings. Okay, there is one very important characteristic of capital goods which we'll just say today, but we'll use later in the course in business cycles, is that we have capital goods of higher order and lower order goods, which also called capital goods. And it is relatively easy to convert very high order capital goods from one intended use to another intended use. And it's very hard to convert a low order good from its intended use to another intended use. Let's say a low order good may be a bread that is being baked in the oven. It is already in the oven, it's been baked for a little while. It's very hard to get it out of the oven and decide to make a cake out of it. It's almost impossible in real life to do that. On the other hand, if you just use the wheat, you can use the wheat for many, many various things. In between wheat and in between bread, there is flour. You could use the flour for many other things because flour is one step farther away from the end good, and flour could be used for thousands of things. And yet, you could use bread already in the oven for very few or anything else but bread itself. Sure, I mean, you could use still bread to feed people, but you could use bread to feed animals. But the general concept is high order goods could be used for very many things. Let's provide an example of extremely high order goods. One of the highest order goods in nature is water. Yes, you can use it for tens of thousands of different applications. Another example of very high-end goods, well, one of the highest would be land itself. Land is kind of like been always present and can use it for millions of different things. Getting closer to modern day, a very high order good will be oil, crude oil. You can convert it into diesel, into gasoline, all sorts of lubricants, etc. You may get using it at one point in one stage. They say, oh, you're not going to really use it for gasoline. You convert it to something else, or you already get a gasoline to use in a car, but instead you're going to use it, let's say, in a lawnmower, etc. So this is a fundamental concept that plays a crucial role later on in the theory of business cycles. The next fundamental concept is that of savings. And saving is simply the postponement of immediate consumption and leaving that whatever has been produced for either future consumption or for future use as an intermediate good or as a capital good for further production down the road. So that's what saving is. A different way to think about saving is that it is a sacrifice made today for having more and better things in the future. When I say things, I mean stuff like ends and goes. And saving has one fundamental characteristic I already clarified within the concept of capital goods, and that is namely that saving creates a capital good or results in a capital good. So this one is saving. We move on to investments. Okay, so the process of investment is simply that of accumulating capital goods. So, investment is the accumulation of capital goods. You cannot possibly ever get a capital good in any other way than investment. There's no other way. In other words, we simply call the accumulation of capital good investments. The next thing is, I've already clarified, it requires prior saving. And I move on to the next important concept, and that is time coordination. Time coordination refers to the balance that we achieve between consuming today and postponing for the future. In other words, it is the balance between consumption goods and future goods, which we call capital goods. Time coordination critically depends on the concept of time preference. Another important characteristic is that time preference, jointly with time coordination, determine interest rates. And I'm not going to set anything now because interest rates are coming in a couple of minutes. And the next concept is that of capital structure. And capital structure is simply the collection of all capital goods that we use in each of the stages of production in order to move resources, or in order to move intermediate goods, which we also call capital goods, into the next stage. So the capital structure consists of the capital that belongs to each consecutive stage of production. One important characteristic of capital structure is that the longer the capital structure, the more productive it is. The reason is that of time preference. If you have possibly a shorter production structure that is more productive, then because time preference is always present for producers, producers will always choose the shorter production structure so that they can profit and benefit more of it. So, the assumption is that producers behave optimally in the sense that they always maximize their profits, and if they maximize their profits, implies, or it follows from it, that if there were a shorter production structure that is more profitable, it will certainly be used. Because we kind of assume that they are always efficient, meaning profit maximizing, then it follows that if it is longer, it must necessarily be more efficient. Otherwise, it would be already used in real life. Okay, then we move on to the next concept, and next concept is that of capitalist. It is interesting, I teach 200 and 400 level courses. I have seniors now, and I say, Pastor, what is a capitalist? Who is a capitalist? And they're a little bit baffled. Kind of like everybody knows what capitalist is, but really can't give a good, proper definition. Actually, one of the reasons is that there are different notions and understandings of what capitalist is. And this is simply the person, or the person who simply saves and provides funds or savings in the form of capital. So, this is the person that provides capital by saving his funds. So, essentially we can say that capitalists are the sources of capital. It's coming in a minute, what capital is. Then we have the next concept of depreciation. I explained depreciation. And I explained last time what depreciation is. This is the loss of value of already existing capital due to its wear, tear, and obsolescence, maybe technological, maybe moral, or any other obsolescence. If you have a house, 1 year later that house will depreciate simply due to the effects of nature. If you have a computer, 1 year later it will work, but it's going to be 1 year older, and because new, more modern computers have come with better functionality, this computer has certain depreciation into it, even though it may possibly not lose its full productivity from a year ago. So depreciation is also associated or is intimately related with the concept of time. In other words, as long as you have capital, because time is always present, depreciation is always present. Then we move on to capital. And capital is probably one of the most confusing concepts in economics, and it's even more confusing because it's extensively used in finance. Effectively, there are like 3 or 4 fundamental different understandings of what capital really means or what capital really is, and I'm not going to get to clarify all of them. But first of all, we just give a straightforward definition, and the definition is that this is the market value of capital goods. This is the market value. So this guy's got $10,000 capital. Essentially, this is what the market value is of his capital goods. Well, his capital goods may be in machines and equipment. They may be just a cash in the bank. But this is what the capital market value is. One of the characteristics for capital is that it's used in economic calculation. Economic calculation is associated with the concept of how people figure out what is best to do. And economic calculation is the conversion in monetary terms of the costs of input, the cost of output, and the loss of depreciation of capital, so as to compute or calculate profits and being able to maximize them. The other characteristic for capital is that it is a market value, and if it's a market value, there has to be a market. So it requires markets in order for capital goods to be valued. In other words, you may have certain thing, a capital good, but if you really want to call it a capital, you got to know what its market value is. And the way to know what its market value is to have a market. Therefore, it requires markets. The next concept is that of interest rates, which I have been consistently shortening with IR interest rates in this course. And interest rates has a number of different interpretations. In the theory of production and capital, it is the relative price between present and future goods. In other words, this is the relative price of having a watch today and of having a watch 1 year from today. And that difference will be effectively incorporated as the interest rate. So, if today the watch will have 1 unit, let's say $1, but a year from now it's going to be worth only 95 cents, effectively the interest rate is that 5 units of difference, approximately 5%. Remember that a present good always has higher value than a future good, and this is a consequence of time preference. Okay, then we have the next concept of gross interest rate. And gross interest rate is also sometimes or better known as nominal interest rate. Oh, I forgot here to say on interest rate, smile lapse, is that present goods to future goods, that ratio is the definition of interest rates in the theory of production and capital, but we have already studied in the theory of money that interest rate is simply the price of money over time, which we sometimes call the rent for money, or the rental price for money. In other words, how much rent you gotta pay to borrow and use money for 1 year. So interest rates, or gross interest rates, or nominal interest rates have a number of components. The first we call pure interest rate. Pure interest rate. And pure interest rate is sometimes known as natural interest rate. And it is also known in more modern economics as real risk-free interest rate and pure interest rate or natural interest rate is what is effectively the relative price of one good relative to today's present good relative to a future good whenever there is no risk. However, in real life, there is always risk in the form of sometimes of uncertainty. I'm trying to find out of uncertainty, which also is associated with the concept of risk. Usually it takes long to explain the difference between risk and uncertainty. The basic simple explanation or definition is that risk, we can compute what the probability of the various outcomes or events are, while in uncertainty we cannot even compute what the odds are. For example, many of the natural phenomena are of the nature of uncertainty, like earthquake. We can't even compute over the next 12 months what is the likelihood of getting an earthquake here in Bulgaria. With risks, we may possibly compute what these are. For example, when you flip a coin, it has a 50-50 chance. So, when we can compute probabilities, we call it risk. When we cannot compute probabilities due to the nature of that thing, earthquakes, maybe volcanoes, we call that uncertainty. So, another component of gross risk is a so-called gross interest rate is a risk component. It is also known as default. And that risk component is sometimes called risk premium. Risk premium. And this is the interest rate or the percentage that we add on top of the pure risk-free interest to compensate ourselves for a higher risk of either production not working out or a loan not getting back. Let's provide a simple example. Suppose we have a loan and we're trying to loan to somebody, and the risk-free interest rate is 5%. So we call this risk-free or natural interest rate is 5%. If there is certain chance that this guy is not going to pay back his loan when it's due 1 year from now, we may add a risk premium of, let's say, 3%. If the borrower has a higher risk, we may ask him for a 5 or for an 8% interest rate. So, with risk we add, and we would simply charge 8%. But there is yet another type of risk, and that other type of risk we covered last time, and that is inflation risk, and therefore by the component we call inflation premium, which is added on top of the pure interest rate and on top of the risk premium to compensate us for the loss of purchasing power. So we call sometimes this purchasing power component of interest rate. The previous one is risk component of interest rate, and the first one is pure interest rate, or the natural component of interest rate. Then we have 26 is a basic relationship between some of these components, and it's fairly straightforward, is that having lower time preference means that people with, let's explain different. People with high time preference like to consume today. People with low time preference prefer to save today. So lower time preference leads to higher savings. S designates saving, and upward arrow means that higher savings. And higher savings, which is the same as more abundant savings, leads, other things equal, to lower interest rates. So interest rates are lower. So when people shift their time preference to lower, they make savings more abundant and reduce the pure interest rate, or the natural interest rate goes down. This is extremely important relationship in money and banking. It is extremely important relationship in economic growth, which is coming. It's extremely important relationship in the theory of business cycles, as there are fundamental differences which I'll be explaining later on for the difference between these two. Okay, the next concept is that of intertemporal coordination. Temporal coordination. And intertemporal coordination is guided by interest rates. So intertemporal coordination refers to the how the structure of capital is designed so as to serve the goals or attaining the ends of people in a most productive manner. Intertemporal coordination refers to the ability or the function of interest rates to create an optimal production structure. An optimal production structure, as I have shown before, a production structure we usually draw like a pipeline. And in that pipeline we have here on this side, on the right-hand side, we have, let's say, consumer goods. So we have here the low-order capital goods. We have here high-order capital goods. And an optimal production structure is one where capital goods flow from one stage to another without inefficiencies. And now we're explaining what inefficiencies mean. Inefficiency means one of two things. It may mean bottlenecks, and a bottleneck will be one where, for example, production structure is like this, and it's getting hard to get through. And it may mean also inefficiencies of wider than necessary production structure. For example, we have bread, and an oven usually can bake in a day 1,000 breads. And this town has 50,000 people. Each person eats about, let's say, one bread. So we have one oven. One oven has 1,000 breads. We need 50 ovens to get 50,000 breads. So in an optimal production structure, if we usually need 50,000 breads today, we'd have approximately 50,000 ovens. You will have a bottleneck when you have 30 or 40 ovens. You have the wheat, you have the flour, you got everything, but simply not enough ovens to get through, to get them to consumer. On the other hand, it will be also suboptimal to have instead 100 ovens that will have a capacity to produce 100,000 breads, when in reality we need only 50,000. Thereby, half of the ovens are empty or unutilized, or each oven is used at half of its capacity. So, in this case, we have oversupply of a particular capital good. Let's say the oven will be at stage 1 here. So, when you have 100, it's kind of like having too many ovens relative to the wheat that comes around, or relative to the bread that go out. Or in the other case, if you have only 20 ovens, you have a lot of bread that's got to come, but not enough ovens. So in this particular case, the production structure will have a major bottleneck. In other words, they cannot get through, not enough. So this here, you can think of as, this distance here as the number of ovens. This will be, let's say, 20 ovens. This distance here will be, let's say, 50 ovens. And if you use that one here with overcapacity, is 100 ovens. In other words, let me summarize or recap this whole discussion, is that the production structure, in order to be efficient, must be smooth, and smoothness means that there are no stages. So this is stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, stage 5, stage 6, so that there is no stage that has substantial overcapacity which is not utilized, or undercapacity which is thereby not enough to go through it. A classical example that exists today in the United States, where you have a particular capital structure, is that of the oil industry. And somewhere a couple of steps before you get your gasoline in the gas, there is that production facility which is called a refinery. And a refinery is simply a plant, a chemical plant, that takes crude oil and converts crude oil, after a number of mini steps inside, into a gasoline. Then the gasoline gets shipped to the gas station, and then from the gas station to the consumer's car's tank. So, a classical example today is that in the United States there has not been built a single refinery in 30 years now, since 1976. Up until 1976 there has been many refineries built. There's been substantial increase in the number of refineries in the 60s. So in the United States there has been substantial oversupply of refineries, to the point that in 1976 only 45 to 50% of them were used. None has been built, and and the demand for gasoline has increased to the point where over the last 2 or 3 years, 2004, 5, and 6, there have been problems with refining capacity in the United States, to the point that all the oil that enters into the United States cannot be properly refined into gasoline. Now, why and what the causes are is other problems. So, the United States is forced to import already refined, ready-made gasoline from Venezuela. So, refining is a very real-life example of problems within the overall production structure, and this is coming out of, or relates to, this concept of intertemporal coordination. Intertemporal coordination relates to interest rates in combination with profits that provides incentives in those cases where the production structure is relatively narrow, which means that there is a relative shortage of these capital goods, to raise the price of those capital goods, and by raising their price, It also affects the interest rate or the return on those capital goods. By raising their price, it raises the return, it attracts investments into this particular sector, and thereby coordinates back the production structure to make it more efficient. Before, in the late 60s and early 70s, there has been such a phenomenal oversupply of refineries to the point that return on refineries were so low that it was not profitable to invest in refineries. In other words, return on a capital good is effectively what interest rates represent. Interest rate represents yet another concept, that of a return on a particular capital good. So, as long as you have one and the same interest rate across the board, this means that wherever returns are lower, and they are lower because there is overcapacity in the production structure is wider, it will mean less investment, and whenever it's tighter, returns will be higher and interest rates will be thereby higher, and therefore interest rates being uniform across the economy, because they are uniformly. 5% interest rate refers equally to consumer goods and producers' goods, at least the pure interest rates. Of course, production, consumption will have different risk or default component. Thereby, it coordinates and makes it efficient. Is this guys made it clear? Yes? All right. Okay. So, that's intertemporal coordination. Then we move on to, well, that's actually 28 is what I have in the notes, is coordination actually occurs, as I have said, simply because in the economy you have the same natural interest rate across the whole production structure. It is the same because credit institutions will simply give the same interest rate, and if someone's willing to pay less, they're not going to give them interest rate. Okay, then we get to the next concept of rate of profit. Rate of profit. This is actually 29. I missed to put it in there. And the rate of profit is the net income at each stage of production. Is the income for each stage of production. I've already explained production structure. And then we have the next concept is 30, which is inventories. And inventories are simply capital goods. So one way that we call capital goods, we simply call them inventories throughout intermediate stages of production. In other words, this is a capital good which is not yet good for consumption, but can easily be used in production for the next step in order to get it a consumer commodity. An intuitive example of such will be flour. We simply as humans just don't eat flour directly. Yet it is highly valuable, it is a capital good, and it also counts as inventory, which we take on a day-to-day basis to make later on bread. Okay, one other important concept to consider is that it's actually not a concept, it's more of a statement, is value of capital goods in the economy relative to value of consumer goods. So, this refers to one particular point in time. For example, today, as of this moment, March 23rd at 4 o'clock, you have a certain set of consumer goods today in all stores and everywhere, and you may have at home, etc., and they have a certain value. And you also have a lot of capital goods, and they have their value. Can you guys guess what will be the approximate relative value? Would consumer goods have more value, market value on the market, as opposed to capital goods? Which one's going to be more? Capital goods. Why would that be the case? Well, that's not quite... Anyone trying to take a guess? Capital goods will certainly have substantially more value. Maybe 10, maybe 20, maybe 50 times more. Simply because you have many stages of production. For example, a car, producing a car, some have played to compute, has a couple of thousand of stages of production. You have each nut and each bolt and each lug and each window, etc., etc., have thousands of stages of production. And each of these represents or has value. At the end, you have only just a couple of cars. So all of those thousands stages of production have much more value than the ends, which are consumer goods cars at the very end. In general, when you compare the value of shops that you have in town relative to the value of factories and other capital like roads, telephone lines, computers, etc., all productive capital, you will quickly realize that capital has substantially more value than consumer goods. Thereby, it's one of the ideas later down the road in business cycles, by simply stimulating consumption does not necessarily mean that you can stimulate successfully the economy. In other words, if this is the value of the whole economy, let's say the productive capacity, and this year we will effectively produce a little, relatively small percentage will be consumption goods, and relatively large percentage will be capital goods. Now, in this class, with this lecture and with your effort, you are accumulating the capital good of knowledge or education. So, we can try and stimulate through, let's say, government programs to increase consumption, and we may even successfully double consumption from one year to the next with lots of stimuli, government stimuli. But it does not mean that we can increase overall production and overall economic growth, as we may turn out that whatever we gain to increase our consumption, we may simply lose on the production of capital goods. In other words, what may happen is by stimulating consumption, we have actually deterred the production of capital goods. That's because consumption, if you stimulate it, is going to have very high return. So everybody's going to switch to consumption. There's going to be little production. That's one way to think about it. A completely different way to think about it is if you stimulate consumption, and this represents, let's say, the production structure, all you may succeed actually is to push the very last stages faster through the production process, and then have the production structure, the capital structure, empty and nothing. And then what a recession will represent effectively would mean that you will be refilling the emptied production structure. That's quite allegoric, but effectively represents one fundamental view of business cycles. So, in essence, the point to understand here is that when you have economic activity, it is the production of both consumer goods and capital goods. And when you have GDP, which is only the production of end or consumer goods, which is this portion, consumption or GDP is a tiny percentage of economic activity. And you may stimulate successfully consumption, but it doesn't mean that the end result will be a successful stimulation of capital goods. And this is pretty much what I had for today. Let's see what you guys have in terms of questions to clarify from today's lecture. Let's see what questions you may have. Anybody? Is it fairly clear? Does it make sense? No questions? Alright, so we are done. Next time we continue with economic growth. We will build entirely as economic growth stands on production and capital. We'll build entirely on economic growth. This is the first couple of sections, maybe one or two sections from DeSoto's textbook. It's 2006 edition, DeSoto Chapter 5. And then the middle portion of Chapter 5 will be economic growth. And the second half of DeSoto's Chapter 5 is business cycles. We'll take approximately 1 or 2 lectures on growth and maybe 3, 4, or 5 lectures on business cycles. Okay, well, then we're done for today.